Hello and welcome to the Super Casuals. My name is Auronado, and today we return to my series comparing the fundamentals of the World of Warcraft over time. Today we will be talking about the danger of the World of Warcraft. The world in World of Warcraft doesn't feel like it used to, with the combination of monsters being so weak, classes feeling so strong, and transportation around the world being so fast and plentiful. Any engagement with anything on the map other than your target feels like an inconvenience. There is no sense of danger in the world anymore, and it isn't just because players know so much more about everything in the game. Classic was absolutely brutal on players. Even in the earliest areas of the game, death was potentially around every corner. If you pulled too many creatures, you were probably dead. Humanoids would often run in fear at low health, potentially running into other humanoids who would then try to kill you. Some creatures could shoot at you from range with weapons and spells. Some had health potions or healing spells. Some creatures could hide with stealth abilities and would often attack before you could even see them. Many creatures had ensnares, stuns, slows, and other abilities that would make escape difficult or impossible. All of them ran faster than you, and these were just the normal run-of-the-mill creatures. Players were forced to be smart when they pulled targets, lest they quickly be overwhelmed and killed. If that happened, chances are they'd be running back to their corpse from a graveyard inconveniently located halfway across the zone map, so there was a very strong incentive to not die, even aside from the repair bill for fixing gear. The players themselves were not particularly powerful either. Warriors and rogues could not heal themselves and had no choice but to take hits. Casters quickly ran out of mana. Downtime for players was very high, requiring people to sit and restore resources by eating and drinking after just one or two creatures. Hunters and warlocks fared better because they had pets to tank for them, and mages could offset the cost of food by making their own. Speaking of mages, they were the only class capable of pulling big packs of monsters while solo. Warlocks had a limited ability to do this, with damage over time effects and controlling all the creatures with fear. Everyone else was limited to one or two creatures at a time if they were alone. Even two at a time could very easily mean death. On top of this, the world was full of elite areas that meant death for players not in a group. There were a few special elites that roamed around in non-elite areas, which were often much higher in level than the surrounding enemies, and squashed hapless players like bugs. There were some areas reserved for world bosses that were packed with high-level elites, way out of the level range of the rest of the zone, and venturing anywhere near would spell certain doom for those not fleet of foot. The layout of the world wasn't streamlined either. For example, Forsaken players started in the zone right next to the Plaguelands, one of the highest level areas in the game, and there was nothing stopping an unassuming young zombie from running across the border and meeting his first skull-level enemy in the form of a welcome bear. Compounding the weak characters with the powerful creatures, players were stuck running around most of the world until level 40 when they could buy their first mount, if they could afford it. Even with abilities like Ghost Wolf or Aspect of the Cheetah, it still took a very long time to get anywhere. All that time out in the world, surrounded by dangerous things, made the world feel very dangerous. This was especially true if you were on a PvP realm and you might get attacked by players on the other faction at any time. When the Burning Crusade came along, the very first thing players see when they enter the Dark Portal is an endless stream of skull-level demons swarming the friendly NPCs, trying to break through and invade our world of Azeroth. We were transported above and around, then placed into our faction camps, where plenty of little conversations occurred amongst the guards, describing how tough all the new bad guys are. And if you were on a PvP realm, when you saw the other faction's camp just across the road, you knew they were out to get you. Much like with vanilla, creatures often had really nasty abilities to keep things interesting. There were once again elites roaming around, such as Tagar Spinebreaker, who wandered around camouflaged amongst the other fell orcs with his stupid 8-second stun that felt like it never ended because he'd slap your head off long before it ever could. Still hate you, Tagar, jerk. Of course, who could forget that mechanical colossus that would somehow always manage to sneak up on you when you least expect it? The Fell Reaver itself. The power jump from new skills and talents was less pronounced for this expansion, and players felt like improved versions of their older selves. Some specs received bigger boosts than others, but nobody was truly overpowered. The zone borders were progressive, and you'd have to go out of your way to find areas where monsters were much higher level than you. The world had a better flow, and as your character grew stronger, the creatures remained a solid threat. Ultimately, you would reach level 70, but that's when the danger of the world started to fall apart. Now you could buy a flying mount and just avoid most things. There were a few scattered areas where if you flew too low to the ground you could get mauled, but generally speaking, you were now safe from both monster and hostile player alike. Wrath of the Lich King is when things really started to change. The new skills and talents boosted many classes through the roof. Numbers rapidly ballooned, and a creature that used to take 20 to 30 seconds to die would now go splat in 10 seconds or less. Healing skyrocketed alongside it, and it became common to see players blow each other up in mere seconds, or see players healed from nearly dead to 100% in a single cast. It was a crazy time, especially before players had PvP gear to reduce the incoming damage. Many specs now had easy access to powerful area damage, and it was common practice to pull groups of mobs and cleave everything down. Not everybody could do this, which made the have-nots have envy. After players grabbed a few pieces of new gear, there were a few truly dangerous creatures roaming Northrend. The exceptions to the rule really only served to point out the contrast. Yes, the frostworms and ice crown would eat you alive if you flew anywhere near them, but compare that to one of the ghouls on the ground. Some classes might be able to kill those in one hit. While leveling through Northrend, you would see Arthas occasionally pop up during some of your quests. But having the Lich King pop up like Dr. Claw every so often to tell players he'd get them next time gives mixed feelings. On one hand, it's nice to see him doing something more than sitting in his raid dungeon like an Illidan or Kael'thas. On the other hand, because he doesn't actually do anything, he didn't really feel very scary at all. Players were allowed to fly much earlier this time, and by now, the cost of the faster flying mounts was in reach of most players. Flight paths were rarely ever used, and most of the world was left ignored while players just zipped over everything. Player power had skyrocketed, transportation was faster than ever, and the world felt less dangerous than ever. Cataclysm brought enormous change to many classes. Area damage was now drastically reduced in power, and single target often took time to ramp up. Players were generally forced by way of class mechanics to pull fewer creatures simply for the sake of overall efficiency. This felt like artificial difficulty due to how powerful we had just been, and left a poor taste in the mouths of many. This time around, the creatures of the world were generally all pushovers. With the old zones of Azeroth all being redone, there just wasn't time to make each individual creature unique and interesting. Unfortunately, this meant that all of the old world content that used to be dangerous was gone. No more elites, no more truly dangerous creatures, and quests showered players in gear which kept them constantly upgraded and ready for anything. The same was true of the new zones. Players had access to flying right from launch day, and could ignore the world as much as they wanted. To make matters worse, mobs themselves were now spawning farther apart from each other and in fewer numbers, so the days of areas swarming with baddies was over. Even without flying, getting through hostile areas was easy. The World of Warcraft felt like something fundamental was missing. Everything was now streamlined, simplified, and straightforward. There was no danger in the world. With no challenge for solo players, the game suffered tremendously. Mists of Pandaria was an interesting time. Class design was, for many, at its peak during this expansion. Characters were powerful on their own, and the new abilities they got from the new talent system just made them stronger. In contrast, many of the creatures in the earlier areas were downright silly, and the effect was pretty jarring. It doesn't matter how powerful they make the creature, it just felt weird to be fighting rabbits and beer elementals. More effort was made to make the creatures of the world dangerous. There were some nasty abilities out there, especially on the rare monsters. Once you hit the new max level, getting gear was heavily gated, so it took longer for players to outgear and overpower the world. This helped to keep the world feel more dangerous, but felt like artificial difficulty once again. Flying was allowed only at max level this time, and this served to keep the world a hostile place while leveling. Later in the expansion, entirely new zones were added, which disallowed flying completely, and they were great. This time around, many of the creatures were truly deadly, especially if you weren't paying attention. Not just the rares. There were many positives about Mists, but the theme they chose ultimately detracted from what could have been a much stronger expansion. For Warlords of Draenor, Blizzard chose not to add new skills or abilities for most classes. Instead, as you leveled, the abilities you already had would be improved in some way. They might hit more targets, they may cast faster, just passive boost to what you were already doing. That said, the vast majority of creatures in the open world were a bad joke. There were some special rare spawns or named quest mobs that contrasted heavily by comparison, but for the most part, players would crush anything they encountered. Many a joke was made about how we were supposed to be terrified of this new iron horde, but we the players were slaughtering them by the hundreds, sometimes literally in a single quest. Flying was not allowed at all this time, at least until a later patch, when they gave in to player demand. The world still didn't feel dangerous even on foot, so the argument against flying fell flat regardless. Much can be said about the faults of this expansion, and we can definitely add a lack of danger in the world to the list. Legion started the new level scaling system. This meant that it made no difference which order you chose your leveling zones. The creatures would always be the same level relative to you. As a concept, this is a stupid idea. Creatures magically growing more powerful just because makes no sense, and pushes the game even farther from its RPG roots. Being able to go back and squash old enemies allows players the opportunity to really feel how far they've come. For Legion, instead of getting new spells or talents, everything new was tied to the fancy weapon each class specialization would get. As the weapon grew in power, so did you. Unfortunately, many of the really important class abilities were locked in the weapon itself, so the people leveling before Legion content were stuck without them. Most of the creatures in the world were not particularly threatening. They had more health and damage as you leveled, but players continued to be so incredibly powerful that some slightly bigger numbers aren't going to be enough. Legion continued the trend of not allowing players to fly at all, at least until a bunch of hoops were jumped through at maximum level. This expansion was hyped to be a return to the more serious tones of Warcraft, with multiple major lore characters getting offed along the way. Unfortunately, the world just wasn't dangerous enough to back up the hype. I can only speak of my knowledge of Battle for Azeroth from my time in beta, as I did not purchase this expansion. As I so famously mentioned in my review video, while leveling in Battle for Azeroth, players get nothing! No new spells, no new talents, no new abilities whatsoever. In fact, many classes lost a great deal of abilities that they just had in Legion. Battle for Azeroth kept the level scaling from Legion, and this time around the world did indeed feel more dangerous. This is because your character was literally growing weaker every single time it leveled, while the baddies of the world were growing stronger. This felt horrible, making players not want to level at all. I played a melee character, but I've been told that casters have it especially bad in Battle for Azeroth. Apparently there are tons of creatures in the open world with interrupts or other abilities that mess with spellcasting. As if the scaling and ability issue wasn't bad enough, casters were now at the mercy of being locked out of doing anything at all while slogging their way up to max level. Once again, no flight for players was allowed, so players began avoiding combat with anything not related to their current task because it just felt like a waste of time. For this expansion, the combination of losing many player abilities, alongside of watching your character get weaker over time, did succeed in making the world more dangerous again. The problem is, this was done in ways that made the players feel awful. Going forward, I would recommend Blizzard take a long, hard look at what made people enjoy Classic and the early expansions so much. Even as the players grew stronger, learned new skills, had new options in combat, and found better gear, the world continued to have a sense of danger. Different creatures provided different levels of danger in different ways. Maybe this caster mob chucks fireballs that do a ton of damage. Maybe those murlocs are fast as all hell and run to each other for help. Maybe those ogres are elites and will kill you until you die from it. Maybe this banshee will cast a curse on you, making it very difficult to hit. Maybe there's one super strong guy wandering around you have to watch out for. However it was done, everything added to the sense that the world was a dangerous place. No matter how strong you watched your character get, the world could kick your butt if you were careless. This is no longer true, and the game is suffering because of it. Nowadays, the only real danger in the world is found in dungeons and raids, but that's the topic for the next video. I thank you for watching the Super Casuals. My name is Auronado. Remember, keep it casual. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more.